Hello everyone, Brian Kelson with you again, and helping you to rightly divide the Apostle Paul. You know, when we carefully examine Paul, we discover that when he uses the word grace, and when he speaks about my gospel, that we should be very careful not to decide hastily that the use of the word grace in the apostle means the dispensation of the grace of God as found in his writings after Israel was set aside nationally at Acts 28. I know this is anathema to some, but the Apostle Paul must be rightly divided. Many of you are discovering that Romans through Philemon is in fact a dispensational disaster. But when we examine the writings of the Apostle Paul in the Acts period, Romans, Thessalonians, Corinthians, Galatians, I'll put in Hebrews, we discover that his dispensational themes are purely promise and prophecy. Now, what I'd like to do is have a look at Paul and his gospel, his opening to the letter to the Romans. He said that he longed to speak with them, to impart some spiritual gift to them, that they may be established. The word established, of course, occurring in that closing doxology in verses 25 to 27, where some have confused the mystery that was kept silent with the mystery in Ephesians, which was hidden. I have some material on that. In fact, I'm writing lessons now. If you haven't subscribed, log on to acts28.net and subscribe to my lessons to follow this development of comparing that mystery at the end of his letter. But right now we're going to be at the beginning of his letter, where he says in verse 15, "So as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation, to every one that believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek." So straight away in Paul's gospel in Romans, we find that there is a dispensational advantage for the Jew. This is not the creation of the one new man in Ephesians. You'll find Jew first in Romans chapter 2 as well. Verse 17. "For therein is the righteousness of God revealed." In that gospel Paul is preaching, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. What does it mean from faith to faith? Well, I should have finished the verse. As it is written, the just shall live by faith. Faith into Christ, believing on that Lamb of God, brings about the righteousness of God which is reckoned upon the believer. And the faith of that believer is what sustains him living the life as a believer. And that is one great theme in this epistle, which I have to touch upon in this video. Remember, these are not comprehensive. They're just launch pads for your further study. So here we have the Apostle Paul opening his letter to Romans, not with an exposition as to how righteousness is reckoned. That doesn't come to chapter 4, where he turns to Abraham, the priestly figure, and David, the kingly figure, or the one to who was promised a son to sit on his throne. Isn't it fascinating that righteousness reckoned by faith and the grace of God is found in Abraham and David in Romans? What a dispensational block of truth that presents to us. In other words, grace in Abraham and grace in David are not members of the church, which is his body, but members of that great earthly kingdom where Abraham looked for a city, where David was promised a king's son. That's justification by faith in Paul in Romans chapter 4. But in chapter 1, he turns back to Habakkuk. Now, Habakkuk says this, as it is written, the just by his faith shall live. And that's the emphasis in Habakkuk. Now, what else is in Habakkuk chapter 2? Because this is Habakkuk 2 verse 4, correct? So let's go over to Habakkuk 2 verse 4 and have a look at the context. Habakkuk 2:1, the prophet says, I'll stand upon my watch and set upon the tower, and I will watch to see what he will say unto me, and what I shall answer when I am reproved. The Lord answered and said, write the vision and make it plain upon tablets, that he may run that reads it. For the vision, verse 3, is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak, and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. Behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him, but, on the other hand, the just by his faith shall live. And in the original, the emphasis on living by faith. That's the opening of Romans. Now, later down in verse 14 of Habakkuk chapter 2, we have something fascinating. It says, for the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Remember, in Habakkuk, we have the Chaldean army, the Lord's judgment upon his people, ripping through the land. Nevertheless, the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. The just living by his faith in Romans chapter 1 is from Habakkuk. The hope and dispensational setting of Habakkuk is the earth. And you say, well, where is that in Romans? Well, we've already had Habakkuk in Romans chapter 1, and the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. In Habakkuk 2, goes back to Numbers 14, goes back to the prophet Isaiah, and both Habakkuk is quoted in Romans and Isaiah is quoted in Romans. And I want to turn now to Romans chapter 15, for Romans 15 is fascinating. Paul writes about the hope. He speaks about Christ being a minister of the circumcision for the truth of God, to confirm the promises made unto the fathers. And this is what he said. He said, in verse 4 of Romans 15, whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comforts of the Scriptures might have hope. The hope of Romans is in the Old Testament Scriptures. One of those Scriptures that Paul references in this great hope passage in Romans 15 is Isaiah. Romans 15:12, and again Isaiah says, there shall be a root of Jesse, and he that shall rise to reign over the Gentiles. In him shall the Gentiles trust or hope. Please note that Romans opens with a reference to Habakkuk. Chapter 2, verse 4, the just shall live by his faith. Habakkuk says the earth shall be filled with the glory of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Paul quotes Isaiah 11, and I want you to listen to Isaiah 11, where the Lord will reign over the Gentiles. The hope of Romans is not the Gentiles blessed in heavenly places where Christ is head. The hope of the Gentiles in Romans is Christ reigning over them, according to Isaiah. And Isaiah 11, verse 10 says this, "In that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign to the people. To it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious." The verse before says this, Isaiah 11:9, "They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." There is no progression in Romans. It starts with Habakkuk, Romans 1:17, and Habakkuk says the just shall live by his faith. And Habakkuk 2 verse 4 says that, and verse 14 says the earth shall be filled with the glory of the knowledge of the Lord. In Romans 15, Paul is talking about the hope before all believers at that time, and he says this. He quotes Isaiah 11, which has the same terminology as Habakkuk. It's the earth in the just shall live by faith in Romans chapter 1. It's the earth in the hope section of Romans 15 when Paul quotes Isaiah 11. There is no progression in Romans from the just living by faith and righteousness reckoned by faith in the grace of God in Romans 1 and 4 to the earth still being the center of Paul's dispensational theme in Romans chapter 15. Now, let's go back to Habakkuk. We're going to go back to Romans chapter 1. And we're going to look at Habakkuk's reference in verse 17. "For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith." The emphasis on living by faith. Faith established righteousness reckoned by God and by the grace of God, but it's the living that Paul will emphasize through. We might have to do a second video on this. But look at verse 18. "For the wrath of God is revealed." What Paul's just said that in verse 17 that the righteousness of God was revealed. But in verse 18 he says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven." What was Habakkuk about again? Righteousness, living by his faith. When? Well, let's go back to Habakkuk. Habakkuk speaks about, in verse 6 onwards, about woe to the Chaldean army. But the Chaldean army had been established by God. In verse 5 of Habakkuk chapter 1, the prophet says this, "Behold ye among the heathen, and regard and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days which you will not believe, though it be told you. For lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity shall proceed of themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, and more fierce than the evening wolves." Oh, so Habakkuk is writing about an army raised up by the Lord to bring his judgment upon a disobedient and gainsaying people. In that context, the just shall live by his faith. Now, chapter 2. This vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak. Habakkuk 2:3. And not lie, though it tarry. Wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. Behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him, but the just by his faith shall live. When this army, and at the end times, all of that trouble that which is to precede the glory of the Lord in the earth, that's when the just shall live by his faith. Paul is quoting a prophet which speaks about the end. Romans is not quoting Habakkuk because he's beginning to disclose the dispensation of the grace of God, which is a new beginning after Israel was set aside. At the end it shall speak. How does Paul close Romans? In Romans 16:20 he says, the God of peace shall bruise Satan under your feet shortly. What did Paul say in 1 Corinthians chapter 1? He told the Corinthians that they would be confirmed to the end. What did he say in 1 Corinthians 7? He said the time is short. What did he say in 1 Corinthians chapter 10? The ends of the world or ages were upon them. What did he say in 1 Corinthians chapter 15? We shall not all die. What did the prophet say? At the end it shall speak, Habakkuk 2:3. What did Paul say in 1 Thessalonians 4:13-18? Twice he said, we who are alive and remain. We who are alive and remain doesn't include you and me. It included Paul when he wrote Thessalonians, when he wrote Corinthians, and the end time was when he wrote Romans. For the God of peace shall bruise Satan under your feet shortly. Romans is not the dispensational foundation of Ephesians and Colossians. Romans is the prophet Habakkuk. At the end it shall speak. That's when the just shall live by his faith. The word grace in the Apostle Paul does not automatically mean the dispensation of the grace of God. Paul must be rightly divided. Romans through Philemon is an ideology of total confusion, a failure of right division. And I praise God that there are many who are beginning to be liberated from that ideology and start to see that the Acts period and the Apostle Paul in the Acts period is none other things than those which Moses and the prophets did say should come. Oh, and one last thing. I did quote Habakkuk chapter 1, didn't I? Where it said in verse 5, behold ye among the heathen and regard and wonder marvellously, for I will work a work in your days which you will not believe, though it be told to you. And that, my friends, is found in Paul's gospel in Acts chapter 13, 40 and 41. So when Paul proclaims his gospel in the synagogue at Antioch Pisidia, he's quoting Habakkuk, and years later when he writes Romans, he's still with the same prophet. No change, no progression. It's at the end it shall speak. The Acts period is not the beginning of anything. Paul in the Acts period is not unfolding anything new. And as we rightly divide Paul, we begin to appreciate that Acts 28 is the great dispensational boundary. And Paul, prior to Acts 28, is promise and prophecy, and Paul, after Acts 28, is revealing things that were hidden in God and away from ages and generations. The Lord bless you as you search and see.